Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Rebecca Kotkin, and I'm on the board here at the Vilna Shul, Boston's Center for Jewish Culture. The Vilna is located in historic Beacon Hill. It's the last remaining immigrant-era synagogue building in Boston and now serves as the Center for Jewish Engagement. We offer opportunities to connect and explore one's culture, experience the arts, and engage in big ideas and pressing issues for Boston's Jewish community. We're thrilled to have Micheline Maynard join us tonight to discuss her book, Satisfaction Guaranteed: How Zingerman's Built a Corner Food Deli into a Global Community. Before we get started, I just want to clarify a few housekeeping rules. First, this program will be recorded and posted to the Vilna's YouTube channel shortly after tonight's program. Second, if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end of Mickey's talk. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Micheline Maynard. Micheline Maynard is a contributing columnist at the Washington Post. She's been a senior editor at NPR's Here and Now and was senior correspondent and Detroit bureau chief for the New York Times. She also writes for The Takeout, Medium, and the Ann Arbor Observer. She's the author of 5 other books and lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, although she's coming to us tonight from New Orleans. Thank you, Micheline.
Hi, I'm so happy to be with you. First of all, I wanted to just say, I think I'm a great-granddaughter of Massachusetts. I know that my great-grandfather was there. My grandfather was born in Holyoke. My dad was from Northampton. And I actually lived in Brookline when I worked at WBUR in Boston. I was senior editor at Here and Now, which goes on and is heard by, I think, over 400 stations across the country. My family has been going to Cape Cod ever since I was 6 years old, and I love Scorton Shores and East Sandwich, and I just got a shipment of little snowmen from Tail of the Cod in Chatham. So I feel like I have Massachusetts with me here in New Orleans. I'm actually spending a year here working on my culinary education. I am a native of Ann Arbor. I was born in Ann Arbor at the old University Hospital, which might mean something to someone who's listening from Ann Arbor. I grew up there. I went away to school, and while I was away at school, Zingerman started. And so I wasn't around for the very first moments of Zingerman's. I caught up with it a little bit later. But I want to give you a little bit of background about how Zingerman's got started and its relationship to the Jewish community in Ann Arbor. So people may know that the elite Ivy League schools had quotas in, I think, way up until probably the late 20th century or so, maybe the mid 20th century. And Jewish students, only a few Jewish students were admitted, and they had to look elsewhere to go to school. One of the places that did not have quotas was the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And from, I think, the beginning of the last century onward, Jewish students were not only welcomed, but they made quite an impression in Ann Arbor. Arthur Miller went to the University of Michigan. Mike Wallace went to the University of Michigan. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him, and I was a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. And we have several synagogues, and our neighbors in my neighborhood in Ann Arbor were some of our closest friends. My neighbors, the Pears, bought my Girl Scout cookies, and my mother bought the bagel boxes from her Hadassah. So we have a very vibrant and active Jewish community in Ann Arbor. When Paul Saginaw and Ari Weinswag got to Ann Arbor, they didn't actually know each other as University of Michigan students. They met after they attended the University of Michigan. Ari's from Chicago. He was a Russian studies major. Paul is from Detroit, and Paul's uncle was one of the most famous gamblers in Detroit, which led him to love Las Vegas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So after they both graduated, Paul was running a restaurant in Ann Arbor. And you can see Paul on the left in that picture and Ari on the right. Paul was running a restaurant in Ann Arbor called Maud's, and Maud's was actually a place where we all enjoyed going. It was hip enough so that we teenagers would enjoy going there, but the food was good enough that our parents would like to go there. And so Paul was running Mods, and Ari came in one day looking for a job. The only thing that Paul had available was a job as a dishwasher. And, here's Ari, who's this intellectual Russian studies major, but he took the job as a dishwasher. And while he was working as dishwasher, he kind of fell in love with the idea of the restaurant world. Now, neither one of them had a background in the restaurant world. Ari, living in Chicago, says that he grew up eating Kraft macaroni and cheese and fish sticks. Paul grew up eating a little bit more Jewish food. Both of them knew what delis were, and both of them thought that the Ann Arbor area could support a deli. They started having this conversation about the ideal deli that they would like to start. And it didn't get off the ground right away because Paul was offered a partnership in the company that owned Mods, and Ari went off to San Francisco for a while, but Ari came back, connected with Paul. By this point, Paul's working in a fish shop. So Mike Monahan, 43 years ago, started a fish store called Monahan's in Carytown, which is a little bit like the marketplace that's downtown in Boston. It has all kinds of different stands for things. There's a meat market and a coffee place, and there's Monahan's Fish Store, which just celebrated its 43rd anniversary. And Paul was working with Mike and liked the job very much, but they kept talking about this deli, he and Ari. So finally, around the corner from where Monahan's was, a building became open, and it had been started as a dry goods store, I think in 1902. And they went over and looked at it, and they thought, maybe this is our deli. But, they had to come up with the financing for it. Ari had a little money from his grandmother. Paul had actually gotten a second mortgage on his house in anticipation of becoming a partner in the restaurant group. They knew they would need a little more money than that, and so they went off to the local banks in Ann Arbor. Well, it's 1981, 1982. Interest rates are 20%. I don't know if people remember that, but interest rates were high. Inflation was very high. I know that during this period of inflation, people have been talking about how difficult it is, but it was twice as difficult back then. They finally found a banker in Ann Arbor who was willing to loan them the money at 20% plus 2%. So they borrowed their money at 22% interest rates. And on March 15th, 1982, Zingerman's Deli was born. Now, here's a look at what Zingerman's looked like when they started out. So this is the original deli. You can see that it's a fairly small building, just a brick building on a street corner in Ann Arbor. There's really no place to sit at that point. If you look inside the deli, there were only a few tables, and then there were the counters, and then there were the staff behind the deli. But right from the beginning, Zingerman's wanted to be not just a deli and not a kosher deli. This is not a kosher deli. As Ari would say, our customers are broader than just people who keep kosher. And he said, I want to eat a Reuben myself sometimes. They decided that they would, of course, offer Jewish food, knishes and latkes and corned beef sandwiches, but they also wanted to try to educate Ann Arbor customers on some of the gourmet items that were being sold in other places around the country. Now, this is 1982. And so we've already seen Dean and DeLuca in New York get started. We've seen Balducci's and Grace Balducci's in New York get started. We've seen Zabar's, of course, and New York still had those classic delis like the Carnegie Deli and the Stage Deli, and then, of course, Katz, and then I think there's one, Russ and Daughters. So Russ and Daughters downtown. But Ann Arbor had nothing like that. So when I was growing up, you had to go to Detroit to get deli food. There was a deli behind J.L. Hudson's, which was our big department store in downtown Detroit, called the Broadway Deli. And we would load up on bagels And, when we went to the department store to see Santa or whatever and bring them back. And there was one place in Ann Arbor that had bagels that came in on Sundays. And if you didn't get to the Blue Front by noon on Sunday, you were not going to get good bagels. You were stuck with Lender's bagels or something like that. So one of the things that Paul and Ari decided was that they really wanted their food to be authentic. And in the book, I tell the story of Cy Ginsberg. So if you come to the Detroit area, Cy Ginsberg is a brand name. He operates out of Eastern Market in Detroit, in downtown Detroit, and he has another deli in the suburbs. And basically, Cy is the guy that you go to if you want to start a deli or if you want to know anything about the deli business. Cy met with Ari and Paul and decided he would take them under his wing and he would teach them how to make a good sandwich. Now, Paul had this idea that he wanted big, thick sandwiches with Russian dressing that would drip down your arms, but they didn't know how to make corned beef. And so I talk extensively in the book about Cy and how he taught them to make corned beef. And he taught them about rye bread, and that the good rye bread that the delis used was basically twice baked. Well, there was no place in Ann Arbor to get that kind of bread. And so Ari and Paul's wife and Cy and some of the other people that worked there were making trips to Detroit 3 times a day, not just a week, but 3 times a day in order to source the rye bread. And remember that because I'm going to come back to it when I tell you about Zingerman's growth. So they got off the ground. One of the interesting things about Zingerman's, if you look at the front of my book, or if you look at their mail order catalog or their website, they have very distinctive graphics. So everything is illustrated. Nothing is, it's not cut and paste. It's all illustrated by hand by their artists. They actually have 3 artists on their staff. The first artist, Steve, came in and was, I think, the 30th employee hired at Zingerman's. And he wasn't hired as an artist. He was hired as a counterman. But one day he started to sit down and sketch. And he liked the graphic arts that you would see from R. Crumb and in magazines like Cream. I don't know if people remember Cream, but I do. And he had this kind of hippie looking graphic style. And he showed a couple of his drawings to Paul, and Paul said, hey, go ahead, illustrate whatever you want to illustrate. So when a new cheese would come in, he would illustrate something about the cheese. If it was made by a goat, he would draw a goat. He would add some sentences about the cheese, what people might like to know about the cheese. When meat came in, people weren't as familiar back then with some of the things that Zingerman's was carrying. Something like prosciutto was not carried in a lot of places. Good corned beef was very hard to find in Ann Arbor. And so Steve would write these little cards, they call them romance cards, I think, and it would explain to people what things were like. And the people like Steve and the others who worked there would be educated. So Steve says when he got there, they handed him a little folder and it was all about olive oil. And he said, I didn't know you could get oil from olives. And Ari says that back then, maybe the grocery stores had 1 olive oil. They had 3. And one of the things that Zingerman's brought to Ann Arbor was balsamic vinegar. So you might know that William Sonoma is credited with bringing balsamic vinegar from Italy to the United States. And Zingerman's decided that they wanted to market balsamic vinegar, and Ari brought in balsamic vinegar and more balsamic vinegar, and then they started bottling it just for Zingerman's. And now, if you were to go in Zingerman's, you would see almost a wall of balsamic vinegar. Each one, if there's a reasonably priced one, there's one that's a little bit more expensive. There's one in the case that costs $250. And so they have essentially educated their customers about gourmet food items. And the interesting thing about Zingerman's is that a lot of people think it was an instant success. It was not an instant success. They were bumping along for about the first 4 years that they were there, because even though they thought people in Ann Arbor had a lot of interest in food, their food was expensive. And it's kind of funny if you look at the prices now. You will pay $20 for a very generous sandwich. And back then you were paying $6.99 40 years ago, but this was when you could get a sandwich for $3.99 or maybe $4, and you could easily eat lunch for $5 or less. One of the things that Zingerman's has always tried to do is explain why its food is expensive. And one of the reasons is that they go for top quality food. They do mark it up, from the wholesale price, but their profit goal is only about 5% a year. And people say, wait a minute, they're only making 5% on a $20 sandwich, that would be $5. And the standard in the food business is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 is your food cost, 1/3 is your staffing and overhead cost, and the other third is your profit. Well, that's kind of an old goal, and it's gotten harder to do in COVID. But one of the things that they always wanted to do from the very beginning was to have an ethical workplace. And very, very, very much from the beginning, Ari and Paul were reading business books, and they were talking about concepts, and they were talking about the way that they wanted to run their workplace. And they wanted it to be a place where people participated and were educated and were happy to be there, because the restaurant industry is a tough industry, and they knew that. And this is, at this point in time, their kitchen was in the basement. So anyone who was prepping sandwiches or others had to carry things up and down the stairs, and it was hot and it was difficult. And that isn't the most attractive selling point, but the more attractive selling point was that you were getting good value for your money. And that's something that they have always believed in. So it took to about 1986, 1987 for Zingerman's to really catch on. And what was happening was, Detroit is a major city, and people would come in to cover news stories like the auto industry or politics. And they would start hearing about this deli in Ann Arbor, and they would get in the car and drive to Ann Arbor. It's about 30 minutes from the airport. And they would eat these sandwiches, and food writers started to come to Ann Arbor, and items started to appear about Zingerman's in magazines like Food and Wine. And Johnny Apple, R.W. Apple from the New York Times, called them the deli of his dreams. And that attracted some customers. And pretty soon people were asking, can you ship us Zingerman's things? Can you send us vinegar? Can we get a corned beef sandwich? It's a little harder to do back then. But they would package things. They'd take phone calls, they would package things up and take them to the post office in the evening and just mail them away. And pretty soon the word was spreading. Then the line was forming outside the door. And especially on football Saturdays, you would see this big line out the door, even around the corner down to Division Street. And it could be an hour to wait for your sandwich that day. But people very happily did it. It became kind of a ritual for folks attending University of Michigan football games to get to Ann Arbor early, to get their sandwiches, enjoy their sandwiches, and then go off to Michigan Stadium. As the word spread about Zingerman's felt that they were in danger of being copied. There is another deli in Ann Arbor called Amir's Deli, and Amir's is still in business on State Street, which is about 6 blocks or so away from where Zingerman's is. They felt that Amir's was copying them, that they copied the idea for their sandwiches. They copied some of the wording about their sandwiches, and even the appearance looked a little bit like Zingerman's. And finally, a lawsuit happened because Zingerman's felt that they were unfairly borrowing from all this that they'd spent 10 years developing. And the lawsuit actually dragged on a long, long time. And one of the things that the lawsuit made them realize was that they had something special, and unless they protected it, they could be copied and they could be driven out of business. And one of the things that they had a great discussion about was whether Zingerman should grow. In 1992, Paul and Ari sat down on a bench that sits out in front of Zingerman's Deli. You can sit on the bench yourself when you visit Ann Arbor. And they had a conversation about the future of Zingerman's. They decided finally that Zingerman's needed to expand its reach in order to protect itself. One of the first things that they decided to do was start a bakehouse. And if you order from Zingerman's mail order, about half of the things that Zingerman's offers in that catalog come from Zingerman's itself. And the very first business that got started was a bakery. And essentially it got started because everybody was tired of making those trips from Ann Arbor to Royal Oak and Detroit 3 times a day to get the bread. And so one of the first things that they decided to bake was their own bread for their own sandwiches. The next thing that they decided to bake was coffee cakes. And I had the pleasure of being in Zingerman's Bakehouse for an entire day and watching the coffee cakes be built. And we have a picture of the coffee cake assembly line. There it is. So basically the ovens are taller than your head. They're a door that opens up, and then they put the coffee cake tins on a baking rack. And I counted 24 coffee cakes at a time that slide into these standing ovens, and they're baked. And the coffee cakes come in different flavors. I would bet anything that there are people listening who've gotten coffee cakes as gifts, or who've gotten them as corporate gifts and that sort of thing. And those coffee cakes come in hot chocolate flavor. There's one that's sort of an Indian flavor. There's plain old sour cream coffee cake. It's really one of their most popular items and easily something that can be shipped. And so that was a real success story for them. They have now grown so that they bake bagels, they bake cinnamon rolls, they bake many different kinds of bread. And that bakehouse sparked a whole expansion of Zingerman's until it now has 11 different types of businesses. So there's a coffee company, which does a lot of wholesale business. They're available in the grocery stores all over the Detroit area. They're available in airports across the country. They're available in a lot of independent cafes around the country. There's a cheese company that they got started because if you're going to have bagels, you have to have cream cheese. And Ari and Paul were not satisfied with the quality of the cream cheese that they were buying commercially. They thought it had too many preservatives and just was too gummy for what they wanted to serve. So they created a recipe using Michigan milk to make cream cheese. There's a coffee company, as I said, there's a candy company. The bakehouse teaches classes. There's a whole section of Zingerman's that does corporate training, and Joanne Chang, who you all may know from Flower Bakeries and Cafe, has sent a number of her employees there. So Zingerman's began growing, and by 2019, they had grown to become a $70 million business. And if you show that next slide, that is how the deli looks today. If you look to the right of the photo, you see a little hut. Well, there's a reason that little hut is there, because COVID upended everything at Zingerman's. So by 2019, which is when I started thinking about writing this book, Zingerman's had grown to a $70 million business. The deli itself does only about $3 million in business a year. And I say only because $3 million is a great size for a company. Mail order is about 45% of the company. There are 2 million names on their mail order list, and they send something out to about 100,000 different customers every single year. I have bought Shiva gifts from them. I like to send gelato. One of my friends told me that she hid the gelato so that her family could eat it after the company had gone. They sell graduation gifts. They sell, other bereavement gifts. They sell sandwich kits, all kinds of things. Mail order essentially saved them during COVID. I had a meeting with Ari on March 16th, 2020, to talk about writing this book and whether they would cooperate. That day, Governor Whitmer in Michigan issued her shutdown order, and Zingerman's immediately had to lay off 300 people. They had to completely change the way that they interacted with customers. And I haven't talked so much about some of the business philosophy of Zingerman's, but this is a company that had taken all kinds of steps, as I said earlier, to include their employees, to make sure that their data was available to everybody in a company or in a business unit that needed to see it. That's called open book management. They believe very much in what's called service leadership, where the heads of these businesses are out there on the selling floor helping customers. You might get waited on by the person who's the partner in the deli, and you would never know that. They just look like another employee. They have always prized their customer service, and that was the big challenge for them, was to make sure that customers at Zingerman's were getting the same kind of treatment, if not the same techniques that had happened before COVID, and that they still felt that their business was welcome. So if you look at that little hut, what that is ordering kiosks. Before COVID, only about 8% of Zingerman's customers ordered their sandwiches online. They really weren't set up with any of the apps that we have now. And they had to totally embrace the whole new system for ordering. And now something like 88% of all the sandwiches that are ordered at the deli are ordered in advance. And if you haven't ordered your sandwich, they encourage you to go in that little hut and place your order. And you can go shop inside now that the COVID restrictions are lifted. You're allowed to browse and you can buy your groceries and that sort of thing. But they really have changed that. They had curbside pickup. The Roadhouse, which is their sit-down restaurant, was closed inside for a while, and you could only order your food in advance and drive up and pick it up. But thankfully for them and for the state of Michigan and others, a lot of those restrictions are now lifted, which brings up the logical question: how did Zingerman's get through COVID? Well, they are back to $70 million. They did drop a little bit for 1 year, but because they shifted their business around, they have recouped some of what they lost, and now they're back to a steady state. And I expect them to be close to $75 million in revenue for their current fiscal year. They have about 100 fewer employees because, as with many, many restaurants, they've lost people who decided, okay, I'm done, or I'm not interested in working in the restaurant field anymore, or I've graduated from the University of Michigan and now it's time to go have another career. I think one of the questions that people wonder about is what's going to happen with Ari and Paul, because Paul recently turned 70 and Ari is in his late 60s. And it's kind of amazing that this business lasted for 40 years, because I'll give you a couple of statistics. 3 out of 5 small businesses fail within the first 5 years of starting. 9 out of 10 are gone within 10 years. So making it to 40 years is remarkable, and making it to 40 years in the restaurant business is even more remarkable. We have some businesses around Boston that have been around forever, but a lot of us can name businesses that are no longer there, like SS Pierce and Rebecca's, sorry, Rebecca, and Lock Ober, and some of the places that some of us grew up with. I was a big fan of the restaurant that was right near Fenway Park, with the cocktail bar downstairs, and they're gone. Eastern Standard's gone, but we hear Eastern Standard might be coming back, which is really great. So it's tough. It's a very tough business, but I think Zingerman's has gotten through COVID and now it's looking at the future. One of the things about all these businesses that they've started is that in order to run one of them, you had to basically put up some investment. If you didn't have money, they would loan it to you. And these are called managing partners. So the idea, as Paul and Ari start to wind down, now Paul is out in Las Vegas, and remember I mentioned Las Vegas earlier. Paul actually has his own deli called Saginaw's, and if you go to the Circa Hotel in Las Vegas, which is in downtown Las Vegas, it's $1 billion with a B development in downtown Las Vegas. You can go to Saginaw's Deli. It's open 24 hours. and there's a life-size statue of Paul where you can get a selfie. So we kind of figure that Paul is the first person who will be checking out of Zingerman's. And Ari, I think, will be there much, much longer. He's in great physical shape and he loves the business and he's such a front man for Zingerman's. And I think he'll be around as long as he can be. But what will happen to all those businesses? Well, the idea is that they'll be owned as sort of a collective by all of these managing partners, and that the Zingerman's food and philosophy can continue as long as these managing partners are in place. And they're getting new people to invest in Zingerman's. It used to be that most of the people at Zingerman's were people that had been started with Ari and Paul, and those folks are retiring, but younger, new people are coming in. Some people didn't even come up through Zingerman's, and they're running these businesses. And I think it's bringing some fresh ideas and fresh life to Zingerman's. And of course, you have to wonder, and I did for my book, what would Zingerman's be worth if you sold Zingerman's on the open market? And I'm pretty convinced that it's $1 billion brand. The reason I say that is there's a coffee company in California called Blue Bottle Coffee. Blue Bottle Coffee was sold before the pandemic for about $725 million, and all Blue Bottle sells is coffee. So it's very possible that Zingerman's is worth much more than that. The idea, though, isn't to find a buyer for Zingerman's. It's to find people who would like Zingerman's to go on as what it is, as the deli, as the restaurants, including the Roadhouse and Miss Kim. And if any of you read Food and Wine and Bon Appetit, Ji-Hai Kim was recently named one of the outstanding young chefs in the country, and she's getting tons and tons of attention. They have the bread business, the coffee business, the ice cream business, and then mail order. And so you definitely will have access to Zingerman's products. And I think for me, before I wrap up my conversation and go to your questions, I am constantly, I'm living in New Orleans for the year. I'm working on my culinary education. And every week or so, a new restaurant or a new food shop is opening here in New Orleans. And you have to wonder, wow, this is such a difficult market. There's trouble getting staff, supply chain issues, inflation. Why do people keep getting drawn to the food business? And my mother always said, people have to eat. And the wonderful thing about America, Boston area, Ann Arbor, down here, is that people are willing to eat things that we didn't necessarily grow up with. And even if we all grew up with a certain type of cuisine, we're interested in learning about other cuisines. We have a huge Vietnamese population here in New Orleans, and I had Vietnamese food for lunch. I had actually Vietnamese food for lunch yesterday, along with all of our wonderful Creole and Cajun food. And I am very excited when I go home to Michigan to have apples. I've actually sent a box of apples back to New Orleans because we don't have apples here. And so I think as long as people really like to eat, there are going to be customers for Zingerman's. And the wonderful thing about Zingerman's is that the University of Michigan is a constant flow of customers for them. They, the U of M Alumni Association is in every city. I watched the Michigan-Ohio State game here with a group of Michigan alumni. And so you have a constant flow of new students in Ann Arbor, their parents coming back, the alumni coming back to Ann Arbor, and then people that just hear about Zingerman's. I mean, Zingerman's is in every major food publication in the country. And so I do think their future is bright. I don't know if their future will be like their past, but I think they have enough fans that they're going to continue. So if you have some questions, I would love to hear them. Rebecca?
Thank you, Mickey. That was so cool. I love hearing the
you.
stories
Yeah.
about Zingerman's, and we're open for questions. So if you have one, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and I'll say them out loud. But maybe we can start, Mickey, if you could tell us, you must have your own memories of visiting Zingerman's as a customer.
Sure. Yeah.
What are some of your, maybe your first memory of going there, or some of your favorite memories of going there?
So I was living in Washington, D.C. and New York, and when Zingerman's was getting going. So I was actually in D.C. in the early 90s when things were really growing there. And I would come home to visit Ann Arbor, and I once in a while would swing by there. There'd sometimes be a line, and I didn't feel like waiting in it. But what really got my attention, I moved back to Detroit in the mid 90s to become the bureau chief for USA Today. And that was an opportunity to spend more time at Zingerman's. And what drew me in was the ability to take classes there. So they teach classes associated with the deli. They teach classes associated with the bakehouse. They have a whole section called Bake with an exclamation point, which are baking classes taught both in person and virtually. So my first memory is actually of taking classes upstairs in the deli. I took a class on gelato, which was really fun. I took a class in butter. That class in butter was fascinating because I don't know if people have heard of Kerrygold butter, but Kerrygold is a cooperative from Ireland, and Kerry has Cork, Ireland is apparently like the center of the butter, Irish butter world. And the head of the Cork Butter Museum was there to give a lecture. And I went up after him and said, that was really interesting. And he said, did you think it wouldn't be? So I took the butter class. I've taken a coffee class. I took a class in flatbreads. I took a class in American cookies where we learned to make whoopie pies. And the whoopie pie class inspired a story I wrote in the New York Times about whoopie pies that was actually featured on The View. And Barbara Walters held that up. And that's kind of like the pinnacle of my food writing. I also took a pie class, and I have to say, I don't have a pie gene. My mother did not bake pie. She baked cookies and cakes and other things, but she's not a pie maker. And so I'd never really mastered the art of crust. And I got to the pie class and I just was totally flummoxed. And I actually started crying. And they came over and they said, you can do this. You can do this. And they kind of comforted me. And then I was able to make the crust for 3 pies, and those were our Thanksgiving pies that year. So I will tell you a story that kind of pulls all this together. In 2007, I was covering the Paris Motor Show for the New York Times, and I had the opportunity to take the cooking class that's taught by Patricia Wells, the famous cookbook writer and teacher. And she's a teaching kitchen. And there's 7 different stations where you prepare, you have a lecture and then you have lunch and you've prepared the lunch. And I was there the first day and I was working with another student and she's observing everyone. And she came over and she said quietly to me, you can cook. And I thought, wow. Well, I credit Zingerman's for that. My mother a little bit, but I definitely credit all those classes that I took at Zingerman's.
Yeah, those classes sound amazing. I to look at some of the online opportunities and see if we could do that remote.
Yeah, they
Um,
fill up. They do fill up, but I think if you wanted to offer one for Vilna Shul, they would set one up just for you, I'm sure. So I can connect you if you're
oh, that would be amazing.
interested. And
Thank you.
Amy Emberling, who is the co-partner of the Bakehouse, is active in the Ann Arbor Jewish community. So I'm sure she would love to work with you on that.
Oh, that would be terrific. We'll have to follow up on that.
Yeah.
So I hear that the 2 names of the people who started it. I don't hear the name Zingerman.
Oh, that's a good question. So there is no Mr. Zingerman. This is the funny thing about it. They thought they were going to call it Greenberg's. They wanted a generic Jewish sounding deli name. They got all the way to a week before the founding of the deli. And it turned out there was a Mr. Greenberg in Lansing, Michigan, the state capital, who owned the name Greenberg's. And he was not about to sell it to these 2 guys from Ann Arbor. So they started thinking, oh gosh, what are we going to call this? And they kind of picked up a phone book. And of course, the natural inclination is to start with an A name, but they thought, let's go to Z. It's the last letter of the alphabet, and that might be more distinctive. And they just literally started jotting names down on a piece of paper and crossing them off until they came up with Zingerman's. And if you look at the logo, the Z is kind of like the Zorro slash. And they wanted something very specific so that people would remember the letter Z. So every so often, someone will walk into the Roadhouse or the deli and they'll tell someone from the counter or the restaurant staff, well, I knew Mr. Zingerman's. And there's no Mr. Zingerman. So you can tell that they don't really know the story of Zingerman's.
Right, who's the poser there?
Right.
So what was your research process like for this? How did you get the information?
Well, I knew a lot of people there. So when I was in Boston in 2016, yeah, 2016. It was a year after my mother died. So she died in 2015. And in 2015, I would go visit her at hospice, and then I would go and sit in the Roadhouse to kind of gather my thoughts. And they have a counter that's in front of the kitchen. And I would sit there and I would try to eat, and then I would watch everybody at work, and then people would come over and talk to me. And I just started to getting to know the staff in the Roadhouse. And then in subsequent years, that seat at the counter kind of became my pedestal, my little perch where I would watch how the restaurant ran. And I'd spent plenty of time in the deli, so I kind of knew how the deli worked. And so I already had a little bit of a background in the operations of the company, and I had interviewed Ari and Paul for articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about their management philosophy. So I had a good grounding in Zingerman's. I got the way the book came about is that Irene Goodman, who is a double graduate of the University of Michigan, master's degree and undergrad, sent me a note out of the blue Thanksgiving weekend in 2019, so 3 years ago, about right now. And she said that she's been a literary agent for 40 years, and she was looking for business titles, and she thought Zingerman's would be a good subject for a book. And for an author, that's sort of like the Nigerian prince that offers you $20 million. I mean, this never happens. And so I checked her out and I thought, okay, she's legit. What about a book about Zingerman's? But why would I write about a book about Zingerman's? Well, books take a couple of years to come about. Novels can take forever. Nonfiction books take at least a couple of years. And I looked at the calendar, and it turned out that 2022 would be Zingerman's 40th anniversary. And we thought, okay, that's a good story, good idea for a book. And then they're a small business that grew, and every small business likes to scale. And so I put a book proposal together, and Irene circulated it in New York, and Scribner's was very interested in it. And as I was mentioning earlier, there was the meeting that Ari came to where he had to lay off 300 people. So my book became not just the history and the management philosophy of Zingerman's, it became how they got through COVID and how they have done after COVID, which added a whole dimension to the book that I was not expecting. So I was right in Ann Arbor, so the interview process was fairly easy for me, but a lot of it had to be done on Zoom and on the phone, especially for the first year or so. And I was able to visit the deli and I was able to visit the bakehouse, but masks and gloves and distancing and things like that. It was only at the very end of my research process that things loosened up so that I could sort of roam around the operations. But if I were to write it now, I would have more access than I did then, but I got enough. I mean, I felt like because I'd been watching the company for years and had just surreptitiously taken a few notes here and there, that I had enough background to understand Zingerman's, probably more than a writer from somewhere else would have had. So, and I was very lucky it was right in my backyard. And then the chefs and other people that I talked to, like Joanne Chang is in there, Rick Bayless from Chicago's in there, Alon Shaya from here in New Orleans, and T. Martin from here in New Orleans. They were all available by phone or by Zoom. And so thank goodness, for Zoom and for phone, because that really helped make the book possible.
Sure, sure. Any surprises as you did the research and set about writing the book? Anything that really caught you off guard, especially for someone who knew the company as well as you did when you started?
Well, I think one of the surprises that I got in working on the book was that Zingerman's has such a global network. And so people like, oh, it's Ann Arbor, it's this one deli, and no, it isn't at all. If you name a food figure, Ari Weinzweig knows them. If you name an artisanal producer of vinegar, olive oil, or cheese, or meats, or spices, they know them. And for example, I'll tell you an example about their spice department. So they sell about 100 different types of spices, but Ari was not an expert in spices. And so he had been thinking for years that, we ought to sell more spices. And he was in Montreal for a cheese symposium, and he got bored at the cheese symposium, and he went wandering around the Jean Talon market, which is a everyday market in a part of Montreal. And he wandered into a shop called Épices de Cru, CRU, and he met the daughter of the owner, and he's like looking around at the spices. They've got hundreds in the store. And he thought, oh, this is great. I'll buy a few and see if I like them. So a few months later, he went to what's called the Fancy Food Show in New York, which is the specialty food industry. And the owners of Épices de Cru were there. They had just gotten permission to wholesale their products in the United States. And Ari brought all the people from Zingerman's who were with him to meet the Deviens, and they ended up becoming a source for Épices de Cru spices. And started with probably one row of spices, and now there's 100 of them, and they come and do dinners, and they sell their cookbook there. And so that has become a really nice relationship. And multiply that by 50, 60 other companies. So we have a company here in New Orleans called El Guapo Bitters. And El Guapo is an artisanal company, female owned, that started selling cocktail bitters. And the artisanal cocktail thing took off. And Krista they were one of her first outlets, and she's since gotten millions of dollars in financing and just expanded her operation. And one of the reasons is that Zingerman's gave her exposure that she was able to leverage into other things.
Yeah. Yeah. The web of Zingerman.
Yeah, it's a real network. And that I hadn't realized just how intricate and extensive it was, but really anywhere you go in the country, whether it's Boston or Chicago or down here, LA or San Francisco or Seattle, there's always someone who went to Michigan who ate at Zingerman's, and there's someone who knows Ari, basically.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned you buy the gelato as a Shiva gift. What's your go-to order if you go there for lunch? What's your favorite thing?
A couple of things. I actually, there's a salad at the deli. I love the salad called the Z Cobb salad. So the Z Cobb is the Zingerman's community of businesses, and the Z Cobb salad is their version of a Cobb salad. And so it's got, turkey and blue cheese and things like that on it. And then if I go to the Roadhouse, which is their sit-down restaurant, I would say 8 out of 10 times I get their fried chicken, which is kind of ironic given that I now live in a city that's obsessed with fried chicken. But they also have, they have stuff for everybody. They have stuff for vegans, they have stuff for vegetarians. They could do gluten-free. I mean, it's really very adaptive to what people are eating. And so it would probably be some kind of a soup or a salad first, and some fried chicken, and maybe a little gelato for dessert.
Dessert, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned you were in New Orleans now working on your culinary education. Is that as a chef, as a writer,
So I write a newsletter on Substack called the Culinary Woman Newsletter, and it's free and people are welcome to subscribe. It's just culinarywoman.substack.com. And I have been doing weekly interviews with different figures around New Orleans. This last Sunday, I interviewed Phil Whitmarsh, who is the executive chef at Jewel of Nola, which is the premier artisanal cocktail bar here, Jewel of the South here in NOLA. And he talked to me about their food program and getting to know people, especially women and people of color in the food community, because one of my goals as I go forward is I love writing about small businesses, which is so ironic given that I was writing front page stories for the New York Times about, the General Motors bankruptcy and about Toyota becoming the world's biggest company, world's biggest car maker. And here I am fascinated by all these folks who are brave enough to start these businesses and find capital and come up with products for them. But I would say it's kind of a metamorphosis from caring about, the biggest to caring about people doing pop-ups. I was really proud because a young woman in Ann Arbor who was doing a dumpling pop-up is just signed the contract to open her first restaurant. I feel like I discovered her, like 2 years ago, and now here she is opening a restaurant. So I would say that one of the reasons I'm here is to meet as many people as I can. I guess I'm setting up my own network of people who are owners, and I guess they call them founders in the tech world.
Okay. Well, Mickey, thank you so very much. This has been really, really interesting. I've really enjoyed it, and I'd like to pass it over to Olga now from the Vilna for some final words.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you, Mickey. That was so interesting to hear. And I was texting my friend that went to school there. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So
Yeah.
I can't wait to go personally myself. And Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time and asking such thoughtful questions. I'm going to just pop up in the chat some upcoming events that we have going on. Our Hanukkah a cappella concert is coming back on Sunday. It is sold out, but we are going to be offering it virtually this year. So we encourage you to sign up. And feel free to email me. I'm Olga at thevilnashul.org, and we'd love to hear any ideas about speakers and content and programming. And thank you both again so much. And I will be posting this to YouTube. Have a great
Great.
evening.
Thank you so much. Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah. Thank you.
Bye.